Welcome to the last of our preeminent tutorials, and this one is indeed preeminent. It's very appropriate that Charlie Catania has put on the screen a picture of Memorial Hall, I think as it was before the spire was replaced relatively recently. Harvard, as you know, is struggling for money. It's down to its last, I think, 20 billion. But they did manage to replace the spire of Memorial Hall. Well, it's conventional when introducing speakers to give you a litany of their degrees, where they worked, and so on. But I think with Charlie Catania, that's pretty much redundant. So I'll just tell you a couple of stories. When I was a graduate student at Harvard many years ago, or a few years ago anyway, there were four great men in the basement of Memorial Hall. V.S. Skinner, of whom some of you have heard, R.J. Hertzstein, George Reynolds, and the fourth one was Charlie Catania. And I'm not exaggerating. Every week or two in our mailboxes would arrive a wonderful experimental or theoretical paper. Catania, Reynolds, Catania. Not so many Skinner papers, a few Hertzstein papers. But my life, at least at that time, was formed by the kind of work that Charlie Catania pioneered. And we all are in great debt for that. He's responsible for many wonderful pieces of research, choice research, an absolutely seminal paper with George Reynolds on timing and schedules, which came out in 1968, but which was circulating in manuscript form for many years before that. He was the inventor of the peak procedure. We cited for it. This is an example of the truism that a beautiful tool may be used for good or evil purposes. And finally, I have to tell one story. I was on the NSF study section a few years after I left Harvard, and a most ingenious, typically Catania proposal was presented that had one enormous flaw. It presented work that he actually wanted to do, rather than work that he had in fact done, and from which he had eliminated all the errors. I was, unfortunately, as I recall, unsuccessful in getting this proposal supported, and this procedure of looking for flaws rather than looking for brilliance and track record has, I'm afraid, become built into our grant awarding system with all sorts of bad effects that I'd be happy to expatiate on some other time. In any event, I'm very, very happy now to introduce Charlie Catania, one of the greats of our field.
Thank you. Let's get this started. Now, here's the title you will have seen, Creating Artificial Behavior, a tutorial on modeling. If you've read the abstract, you know that it was supposed to have been a talk about a model that generates, how a model that generates good approximations to real behavior can help us to see how behavior works. And I think that's really what we're about, is seeing how things work. We're still at the stage where I think as a science we're trying to clarify what the phenomena are, and to see some of the details is useful. And so that is kind of a working description of the way I've tended to proceed over the years. Now, there's a whole bunch of recommendations we can make. Be explicit about the terms and the units and the dimensions in your model. Keep it simple by minimizing inferred entities, and this kind of is one of the things that was mentioned earlier on by others, and the question about whether that's really got any empirical basis or not. Study, but still you want to study intermediate details, not just end products. In a model, you don't want to just look at the output and what you put into it, but you also want to see how things operate in between to see how it's working. My own prejudices are avoiding transformations that distance behavior from contingencies or that mask absolute rates. You can fill it out by turning measures into relative measures, but we'll talk about that later a little maybe. Design the model so it's easy to tinker with it by modifying contingencies or parameters. The model should be one that one can play with. Sometimes in a model, rough-grained is better than fine-grained, and this one is in there mainly as a reminder to say where that belonged when we get to the end if it's time to put this up again. Look for connections between the disparate pieces, but don't overdo it because sometimes the connections aren't there. Know your programming language. Don't lose sight of the problems you began with. But how long should one keep adding to the list? Okay. Actually, just a short while ago, I guess probably a week or 10 days ago, Charlie Schiff had sent me an email asking me how I got involved in this particular model that I'm going to be telling you about. And on the basis of his question, I started thinking about that history and realized that what I should really be telling is the story, and this, of course, you know, is an enormous debt we have to Skinner, who wrote a paper on case history and scientific method. Well, this probably should have been called Case History in the Computer Simulation of Operant Behavior. So substitute this title for the other one, folks. This is the way we're going to go. So here's the general outline of this talk. First of all, what do you want to simulate? And I put a few things up there. Do you want to simulate cumulative records? Do you want to simulate schedules of reinforcement? Do you want to do it moment to moment? Or do you want to do it globally? I'm going to be discussing some of that because it's part of the history that led me to the model I'm going to describe. The model is a model of the operant reserve. Many of you will recognize that as a model that Skinner proposed some time ago to describe operant behavior. So I'll be talking about the reserve. I'll be talking about how it deals with the input and the output, and finally some schedule effects, and then some implications. And you'll remember another thing about Skinner's recommendations is that we should worry about the flight to other kinds of things from the experimental analysis of behavior. And so might models distract us from doing experimental analyses. So that's the overall thing. But now let's flesh it out with the details. A long time ago, my colleague Elliot Chimoff and I were interested in using computers in the early days in our classrooms to teach about schedules phenomena. Long before that, I had watched cumulative records being generated mostly with records of the keypacks of pigeons in standard experimental chambers in the basement of that building that you saw early on as the desktop picture. That was Memorial Hall in those days. In those days, the cumulative records were ones in which a little pen with red ink in it moved along a page in white, and so you get this characteristic red cumulative record. I haven't tried to make the cumulative records that we'll simulate here in red. I'm figuring that this is a tutorial, and I suspect that many people in the room have not had the experience of watching cumulative records being generated, so I'm going to assume a little bit about showing you something about what's in them and how they work. In those days, you'd have strange things happen. You had all the conflicts between one end of the lab, Smitty Stevens' end of the lab, which is mainly concerned with psychophysics, and Skinner's end of the lab, which is mainly concerned with the behavioral things. And every once in a while, one of the people working with Stevens would grab graduate students and say, you've got to show the subject in this experiment. And I was fooled. I couldn't resist this one experiment in which I didn't want to get into it, but it was one on dark adaptation. I had to wear red goggles. And so I was wearing the red goggles, and then went into the pigeon lab to go look at the cumulative records. You know, if you're wearing red goggles and the records are in red ink, you can't see a thing. All those pages were black. Well, fortunately, I don't have to wear red goggles today, nor do you. Chimoff and I, Chimoff is a colleague who I shared many years with at UMBC, more than 30 years. Some of you may know he passed away 2 or 3 years ago. But we did a lot of things together. And one of the things we did was to try to use the early computers to teach things to students. And so one of them was to teach them how a cumulative record works. So one piece we had was the computer would generate a record, that little dotted line along the bottom there, if you can see it here. And then, by pressing the space bar, the student would start the program going, and the program would start drawing a darker line across the top of this, and then if the line got here, the student had to respond, and the student had to respond. And essentially, the student had to lay the the line that was drawn by the computer, well, the line that the student was drawing on top of that line. And then we would go on to a steeper record. In this case, we've got a moderate rate of responding. And now if the student starts it up, the student would have to press a little faster and it would have to vary a little bit. And we had a certain tolerance. And then if the student had filled in the line well enough and got the message, good match, you completed 2 matches, the student could go on to a high rate. And in this one, you could show reset, where when the pen gets to the top, of course, it can't go off the page. And you have this thing that automatically brings it down to the beginning, so you can start it all over again. And then you can let the student produce a record of his or her own, and you can also have the student see that you have these little pips on the record that could correspond to some event like the delivery of a reinforcer. And so we did those kinds of things. Now, one of these background pieces then for all of the stuff I'm going to talk about is that Shimoff was really skilled at computer programming, and although I was involved in many different kinds of things, the one thing that I really needed to get started on was the graphics. And Elliot put together the basic routines. He had trained on PDP-8s, those old kinds of computers, and then what happened was we got the first programming I did was a little Hewlett-Packard handheld calculator in which you had a little magnetic strip in which you could have a 200-step program, and the first program I wrote was a shaping game, which my kids would play in the backseat of the car. It was just a thing where we're generating a number, and whenever you wanted to reinforce that response, you pressed one button, but if you didn't, you pressed another button, and the job was to get this rat to press the lever with a certain force. And that's going to be relevant to the story too, believe it or not. But anyway, from there on, we went to take the shaping game to the big mainframes, and we had deck writers in which students played the shaping game and generated tons and tons of these wide pieces of paper with just one line of numbers down the side. And then came the first Apple IIs. Our first one had 16K of memory. The whole computer had 16K of memory. And then after a while we got onto some more sophisticated things. The programs I'm going to be talking about were pretty much all written in an archaic language called Forth, running under MS-DOS. And what you're going to see are some simulations of the simulations, because I can't run those programs on the current platforms. Anyway, let's move on a little bit. Schedules and reinforcement were in the air. One of the things we wanted to do was to show students what schedules were like. So one of the other things we did was to produce records where we could have the student looking at a computer-generated record on the screen, and the student would then have to essentially do a multiple choice, essentially do a discrimination task, in which the student had to say, well, this record I'm looking at now is a fixed ratio, or this record is a variable interval schedule. And in order to do that, we had to simulate these schedules. And so we had the cumulative record routines, and we had, this is just a little piece, it's the only one I'm going to bother showing you, of the Forth language. Forth consists of words that start with a colon and end with a semicolon, and essentially they're filled with subroutines. So if you type in frsim, it will then fetch a number, add and look and see if that number is greater than some pause that's in there, and then if the pause has not elapsed yet, you'll get one number, or you'll get another number if you haven't. Don't worry about it. This is all reverse Polish logic and notation too, which I always thought was kind of fun. But the point of it is, all of these simulations were ones in which you just sampled, you sampled a number, and then you looked at whether that had a random number, and you looked at whether that number exceeded the random number or not. So essentially all probability generation. You're looking at probabilities. And the thing is, if you were doing a fixed ratio, you had a really low probability of responding during the pause, then you had a higher probability of responding after the pause, and the pause was randomly selected as being a different duration from time to time. If you're doing variable ratio, however, you had generally just a fairly high probability, and it was changed a little bit as a function of the parameter value for that particular VR. If you had an FI, instead you had a probability that gradually changed over time as the FI passed, and if you had a BI, you just sampled numbers that were again sensitive to the parameters. So under circumstance, you'd want to have a VI 10 then, and you'd see something like this come up on the screen. This is a variable interval 10 seconds, not a kind of standard schedule. And this time period, if you look at it, this is an early record. So we're talking about this being a 311-second long record in which there are 253 responses. So the scale of this is going to be a little bit different from what I show you later on. On the other hand, you could do a somewhat longer VI, and you get a similar record, and the rate would be a little bit lower. And I'll tell you, this is not just having responses being generated probabilistically. For those of you who watch real pigeons, cumulative records, that this does have a certain characteristic of what a pigeon record looks like, and you get all those little kinds of things in there that were called knees, and there are all these names for these little variations in the records. And in fact, you find that when you're just generating responses probabilistically, you have many of these kinds of patterns appearing during the records. If you do a ratio, however, you get much higher rates. And there, of course, the reset's really important. Notice, well, in this case, it's not too bad, but we've actually got only 47 reinforcers. But so we're not worrying at all about satiation and these kinds of things. If you have a shorter VR, you get pretty high rate responding. But here, you can tell that's let's see, that's 367 reinforcers. So this bird is a really full bird, even if they're really short duration reinforcers. Of course, if you want FRs, then you can have your probabilities changing over time, and you have that ratio performance. And if the FR is very short, like this one, you get short pauses. If you have a longer FR, then you get longer pauses, and you notice that every once in a while you do get some responding during the pauses. Whoops, like here. And sometimes the pauses are pretty flat. If you make the FR even longer, this is FR 50, then you get even longer pauses. Sometimes you get a lot of behavior during the pauses, and that's a probabilistic kind of thing too. So these are, then you got FIs. So this is as part of the tutorial. As you know, there are interval schedules, there are ratio schedules. They can be fixed, they can be variable. And our taxonomy of schedules is to use these names rather than a more generalized kind of nomenclature. But in those days, what we were interested in was getting the students to be able to distinguish between these different kinds of records and having them see them being generated. And there is something about watching the records being generated as opposed to just getting them flash on the screen all at once. And I can say that from my own experience in playing with the simulations, and that the simulations were much more satisfying if you just watch the behavior develop over time. Here's a somewhat longer FI. Now the thing about this is, and that I hadn't even thought about until Charlie Schiff sent me that email message about the history of this, is that during all of those years in which we were using these as ways to have students learn to discriminate among these different kinds of schedule patterns of responding, it had always been this nagging irritation that each of these schedules was being generated by a different set of algorithms. And wouldn't it be nice if there was a single algorithm that would generate all of these kinds of performances? So that's a piece of the history. And it comes out of a concern with teaching the stuff, but also with a concern with how these different kinds of things can hang together. So, over many, many years, I've been worrying about ways of trying to develop a system in which you could have all of these things generated by a single algorithm. Now, which way do you want to do it? That actually explains why I came at this as something where I wanted to see the schedules generated in real time. And as many of you know, many of the models that are out there are those that look at more mobile or more global or more extended kinds of accounts, the matching law being one example. Now, ideally, we want to accommodate both. We want to have a model that not only generates the moment-to-moment data, but also generates the global stuff. My own preference is to start from moment-to-moment, so I give you a little bit of the history for why that is. But if we do come up with the moment, it would be nice also to show that the global can be derived from it. Because if these are totally different and you can't find a way to connect them, then we're in a kind of a strange circumstances, having these overall measures coming from totally different sources. So let's move on to the reserve itself now and spend a little time talking about this. Skinner's concept of the reserve was an input-output theory. I guess you could think of it as the storage in a battery that's charging up. You can think of it as a hydraulic system. You can think of it a lot of ways. Or you can also think the metaphor should go the other way, that once we understand the reserve, all these other systems and metaphors we can describe in terms of the metaphors of the reserve. But anyway, Skinner's notion was that each response that was reinforced put something into this reserve, and each response that was emitted in extinction took something away. But in Skinner's way of thinking about it in those days, he considered only the terminal response, only the response that occurred and produced the reinforcer. Those other responses were the ones that weren't reinforced. And therefore, as soon as he got into the business of schedules of reinforcement, he was faced with this incredible paradox that you reinforce only some percentage of the responses, and you actually get more behavior out of it. You run an extinction curve, you get an extinction, and you get a whole bunch of responses compared to what you would have gotten if you reinforced every one. And so, based upon that, he pretty quickly dropped the reserve. By the time he dropped it, he was no longer calling it the reflex reserve. He had undergone his transformation in the vocabulary from talking about behavior in terms of reflexes to talking about behavior in terms of operants. But if instead we take into account the fact, it is a fact, that responses before the one that produces the reinforcer also precede that reinforcer, if we take that into account, what we can do is to assume that each of those responses preceding the reinforcer is contributing something to future responding, kicking something into the reserve. And we can also figure that it makes sense that the further back from the reinforcer it is, the smaller its contribution is. Essentially that it has to be weighted by a delay reinforcement gradient. So you do that, and you pretty much got Skinner's reserve. He was so close. And there was another happy accident. I had a computer in which the hard drive crashed. I wanted a Mac, and the people in the computer bookstore on my campus at the time told me that I really ought to wait for the new one that was due in about 6 or 8 weeks. And so I resurrected an old laptop that I had, which was one, and since I couldn't do many of the things I wanted to do during that period of time, I ended up for some crazy reason playing around with it, and having been dared, I guess, by my colleague Elliot Shimon, to try to play a little bit with this idea of the reserve and see whether I could use the fourth language to generate things. And so I took him up on that, and now, but before I get into the details, let me say a little bit more about what goes into this reserve. Okay? The top graph simply shows a single response that's reinforced, when the reinforcer is occurring at this time here, and this is a hypothetical delay gradient. Okay. Now, in this particular case, this response will put a certain amount into this hypothetical reserve, proportional to the height of this curve here, but there are no other responses back here to do anything. Whereas in this case, where we've got a few responses leading up to the reinforcer, we can say this one kicks in a certain amount, this one kicks in a somewhat smaller amount, this one kicks in a still smaller amount, and so forth and so on. So you see, delivering a reinforcer according to schedules is not reinforcing only some fraction of the responses. No! You either can reinforce a single response when you reinforce every one of them, or you can reinforce a whole heap of responses all at once when you reinforce according to schedules. And so that's the starting point for this notion. You push it a little bit further, and now this is going to be real high-powered math, folks. And it's going to involve pluses and minuses. Okay. Let's call the reserve omega and delta the change produced by a response or reinforcer. So here we go. We've got input. You got to put into this reserve something. So you start with some old reserve, okay, omega old, and you add something to it, delta in.
and you get omega nu, which is the nu reserve, okay? So you add, and so that's the input. So whenever a response gets reinforced, it's kicking this stuff into there. The output is responses get emitted, and they get emitted with a probability proportional to the size of this reserve. If the reserve is really big, then the probability is a high probability, and responses are going to come out fairly quickly. As the reserve gets depleted, that probability gets smaller, and each emitted response takes away a fixed amount. And that happens to be useful to know. You could do the reserve somewhat differently and have it take away a fixed fraction, but that does some funny things. So now, here's the thing that brings it all together. In the steady state, and these are the kinds of experiments that many of us have been interested in over the years. What's the steady state performance when you're running a variable interval schedule? What's the steady state performance when you're running a ratio schedule? What you do is you put the bird in one day, you run the schedule, and you put it in the next day, and you put it in the next day, and you keep going until its performance is fairly stable. Its performance is fairly stable at the point when the input is matched by the output. So it just stays there. It's always getting as much put in as it's taking away with the responses. And so what you'd really like to know then in generating this is how this kind of thing can get balanced. Now, one of the things I knew that was in the literature, and based on also some data, was that the decay function for extinction tends to be logarithmic. A lot of people have gotten those kinds of data, and that made sense. I was hung up for a really long time because I thought there were to be something about the output function that should be logarithmic too. And that got me hung up for a long time. And there's probably some moral that one can come up with on that we could add to that other list. I told you that list we could make longer and longer and longer, but I can't think of any quick way to summarize it except, don't make assumptions that aren't right. Anyway, so this simulation takes that archaic fourth language, which by the way uses integer arithmetic, reverse Polish notation. It's limited in the size of the numbers that you can use, and all kinds of other weird things. But actually an advantage of it is you really, as a programmer, are responsible for every little tiny detail. You think of writing a program compared to writing a paper? You can write a paper and you can misspell a couple of words here and there, and sometimes people won't even notice. You write a program and you get one character wrong and the thing won't even run. It means talk about you got to really. So knowing your programming language is really an important part of this, folks. If you're going to go, and I think others have mentioned this, if you're going to go do simulations, learn some programming. Unfortunately, I haven't kept up. I should really learn a more contemporary language, but one of these days I'll mention something. I'll be doing some different things. Anyway, this reserve simulation involves calculating increments and decrements produced by each emitted response in its relation to each delivered reinforcer. So it generates overall response rates because you get a session and you can count the number of responses that happen during the session, but you can also watch the moment-to-moment changes by taking the output and putting it into a cumulative record. In other words, it's both molar and molecular in the stuff you can get out of it. So essentially what the program does then is you're generating responses probabilistically. You're keeping all of the events in an array in which at this point in the array there's a response. At this point this cell is empty. And later you've got another response. Then you've got a reinforcer that in the next cell that's produced by that response and so forth. And then you're just moving this thing along in time and generating events according to schedules. You're producing reinforcers when responses occur and so forth and so on. And that's actually not too hard to do. And certainly wasn't because of all the preparation and all the stuff on graphics that Shimov had set up that made it easy for me to work with these things. And so I again want to express here my debt to the enormous contribution he made to this. So let's start talking about the input. So we can calculate this input, this delta n, by summing all of these increments. And for the purposes of this simulation, the easiest kind of delay gradient to work with is just that the gradient is calculated by 1 over d, where d is the time from the given response to later delivery of the reinforcer. But of course, as many of you know who are interested in delay reinforcement, there's all kinds of other candidates, variations on the hyperbolic or exponentials and so forth, but let's not get into that at the moment. Now, one other piece is important, and that is that when responses occur, they are followed by the reinforcer, but if you have a series of responses, as in the bottom picture here, that then end with one reinforcer, and now some additional responses occur, in order for each reinforcer not to be affecting the responses that have just occurred and the ones that preceded the reinforcer back, and the ones that preceded that one, it is important to truncate your calculation as soon as you get back to the earlier reinforcer. So if you had this long time interval here, and these responses that occurred, you'd sum all of these up. So you have these 8 instances. However, if you had an earlier reinforcer here, essentially truncating this leftmost part of the gradient, then you would only summate the contributions of these 6. And this reinforcer here would have worked only on these responses that preceded it. That turns out to be a pretty important thing. If you don't do that, none of the rest of it works. So you have to have that truncation of the gradient by the preceding reinforcer. And there are, by the way, experimental data as well as computational reasons for justifying that particular choice. So much for the input. So the input then is kicking in to that reserve these amounts scaled in various ways, but essentially it's all linear, adding linearly to the reserve. The output is simply looking at this reserve that you got, taking it as a proportion of some maximal reserve size, and then making that a probability that then generates responses, and add a little bit of variability. There's a little, to prevent the ceiling in which there's a response in every cell you have, it's necessarily limited because this is all a digital system. But anyway, if you do that, by the way, if the reserve drops down to half its size, the probability of responding is going to be half. If it drops down to half again, the probability of responding is going to be half again, or a quarter of the original. What that means is it's going to take you at that point 4 times as long. First it's going to take you twice as long, and then 4 times as long, and then 8 times as long for the same number of responses to come out. If that's what's happening, you're going to get logarithmic fits to responding over time. But anyway, the important thing is, if you do that, what you get is something that really looks like a nice extinction curve. Okay? This is a cumulative record generated just by starting with a reserve. Here's a record now where you start out with a somewhat bigger reserve. So you get a bit more responding out, but it still comes and gives you this nice kind of function. And that really does look like a pretty reasonable extinction record. So there you got it, the input and the output, and you put it together. So and then the question is, what about non-contingent reinforcers? What about reinforcers delivered independently of behavior? And this, so you can do that with the simulation by just arranging for it to drop in reinforcers from time to time without regard to responding, and then having the computer simulation calculate these contributions. And if you do that, the interesting thing is, and we'll do these simultaneously, is that things go down more slowly with response-independent reinforcers, but by this simulation, and as most studies show, there are a few exceptions here and there, but by and large, the bulk of the evidence these days is you don't maintain behavior with non-contingent reinforcers. You may have so-called superstition or accidental contingencies and so forth, which might be the basis for it going down more slowly. That kind of makes sense, that some of these responses are still going to be close to the reinforcers. But even if it's starting out with really high rates, even if the contiguities are fairly short, if the sequence between response and reinforcers are fairly short, then you're still going to get a gradual decrement, and eventually the responding goes away, which is kind of nice. Now, the equilibrium point. See, we've been talking about the steady state. in which if we're going to be running schedules and we're going to run them out to steady state, so that we want to see what's maintained, say, by variable info 1-minute schedule or by some ratio schedule, we run that until the rates are stable, which means our inputs are equal to our outputs. Now, by definition, our decrements in the outputs are constant. Every emission of a response takes away a fixed amount. So this horizontal line is, it's not labeled here, but essentially this is telling us, representing that each of these responses is taking a fixed amount away from the reserve. On the other hand, our input is based on the delay gradient. And so the responses that are close to the reinforcer are putting in a lot, and the responses farther away are putting in a little bit. But there's got to be a point at which these two curves cross. And I'm calling it here the equilibrium point. And at the equilibrium point, the contribution is such that the amount that is added to the reserve, because that response is related to the reinforcer, is exactly equal to the amount that response takes away from the reserve by virtue of its emission. And every response that's further out than that is taking away more than it's putting in, and every response that's closer than that is putting in more than it's taking away. And it turns out that that's significant, because if you start looking at schedules, you can see that with a random interval schedule, you're going to have some responses closer to the reinforcer than that equilibrium point, some of them further away. And if responding goes up, if the rate of responding goes up for whatever reasons, presumably because of what's going into the reserve, it's going to add a lot of responses out here as well as some in here. And the trouble is it's an interval schedule, so that time interval is going to stay the same. And both of those intervals are going to get filled up with responses, and you're going to reach a point in which those kinds of things balance each other out. And hey, we know something about interval schedules. They do tend to generate not too high a response rate. But consider instead a ratio schedule. With a ratio schedule, if the response rate goes up, just maybe because it's just variable, when it goes up, all of the responses are going to get closer to the reinforcer because there's no time limitation on it. If the ratio gets run off a little bit quicker, then all of those responses are going to be closer to the reinforcer, and some of them are going to move from outside that equilibrium point to inside. And as they move inside, they're going to kick in even bigger contributions, and so the rate should be going up and up and up and up. And in fact, one of the problems of running this is you've got to worry about ceiling effects. But hey, that's the way ratios are, isn't it? With a DRL, you've got a response that's out somewhere, and by the way, it could be either inside or outside that point, depending upon what the value of the DRL is. But it can't ever be closer, because by definition, for the DRL, you've got to have this one last long inter-response time, so it's going to guarantee that you will be keeping lots of responses from getting too close, and therefore contributing too much. So that's going to be pushing things down. And yeah, I was going to say earlier that there are very few data around about DRH, but if you have any kind of DRH schedule, like you're superimposing it on a random interval schedule, and so according to some random interval contingency, you're then differentially reinforcing high rates, then you're going to have more and more responses out here counteracting these, and I would say ordinarily you won't even be able to maintain behavior with the DRH, except you might see the performance migrating to something where there are short bouts followed by pauses, and short bouts followed by pauses. And those of you who were here for the last talk will recognize that in fact data such as those in fact exist. So we're going to now look at some schedule effects. We can have random interval reinforcement, random ratio reinforcement, differential reinforcement at low rates. In this simulation, behavior is not maintained by differential reinforcement of high rate if rate reinforcement has a ceiling. And certainly experimentally, if you try to keep a DRH schedule going superimposed on random interval reinforcement, and you require not just bouts, but you require maintained and continued rates of responding, you find it's exceedingly difficult to get anything going. And the simulation at least gives one reason why it may work that way. So here's random interval 120 seconds now, generated by this single algorithm. And so that's the thing that's different now. In these next few, you're going to see the same operant reserve procedure generating these 2-minute records. Here's a random interval, 120 seconds. If you increase, here's a random ratio of 50, and this schedule generates ratios. Here's a DRL. And this astonished me when I first saw it. It was just fun to see this occur because, we often think about the DRL schedule. We know the pigeons on DRLs. Why don't these birds wait long enough? You're asking the bird to wait 20 seconds and then peck. And so, actually, this is DRL 30 seconds. And in this particular 2-minute record shown, you've got 32 reinforcers delivered in an hour. Okay? Yet it's DRL 30 seconds. If the bird were responding efficiently, the bird should be able to get roughly 120 reinforcers. The numbers down below are numbers generated over successive sessions. And it turns out that this bird you just run another session. It doesn't take long, Instead of waiting for a whole hour for the bird to run the session and then you can't run it again until the next day, you can just sit there and you run a session and you run another session and you run another. I was able to do the experiments that George Reynolds and I took a year and a half to do in about an hour. It's kind of, hey, talk about the advantages of computer simulation. It saves a lot of time. Anyway, down here it shows the rates of responding over those 8 sessions. Look, the bird settles in around 5 responses per minute. Well, that's 5 responses per minute is on an average IRT of 12 seconds when the DRL is asking for 30. It's no wonder that the bird collects many fewer reinforcers than the schedule dictates. These probabilistic schedules do allow the bird to put out IRTs that long. And so here you've got what the DRL usually does, and these algorithms have nothing to do with the differential reinforcement of IRTs. Those of you who are familiar with the history of attempts to figure out why ratios are different from intervals will know we talk about differential reinforcement of inter-response times. In the interval schedule, the longer you wait, the more likely it is the next response is going to be reinforced, so that on average, longer inter-response times are reinforced in interval schedules than are ratio schedules. Therefore, those differentially reinforced longer IRTs are what makes PIs slower than PR. No IRTs enter into this. Only the delay gradients and the relation of responses to that equilibrium point and the way in which the contingencies of the schedules allow responses to move in and out among them. How about schedule transitions? What happens if you go from a random interval to a random ratio? Well, here's a random interval performance. One simulated session. And by the way, the program is not generating these records. This is, in fact, a simulation of the simulation. But never mind. Okay, the next session, we start out the next session with a random ratio schedule. And so here we go. And lo and behold, the rate goes up. And if you're not happy with that one more. This one in a single session. This is and there goes the ratio. There again, nothing to do with differential reinforcement of inter-response times. When I used to run an undergraduate lab course of pigeons many, many years ago, the transition from random interval to random ratio was so reliable that students actually did it in the undergraduate lab. And it would always be remarkable how sensitive, nothing at all like us humans, we're rotten with respect to schedules, but all these other creatures would show the transition. And, this is, by the way, where the grain is relevant. Remember I mentioned earlier on that the grain of the simulation matters. If you have a virtually continuous reserve, then each response makes such a and the decrements are small, and each response makes such a tiny, tiny difference, it takes forever for schedules and other effects to be seen. But by making a fairly rough grain, it turns out you can see things happening very quickly, so that the sort of the scaling of the absolute values of the numbers that you work with matter a lot in how these things work. But you can also take session by session data. Okay, So in one experiment, this is again a thing that didn't take very long to do, but you essentially start out with a random interval 60-second schedule and run it for a number of days until it looks fairly stable by visual inspection. Hey, that's the way we did it in those days. Then you switch the schedule to a 120-second random interval, and you run it for a while again until it looks stable, and then you make it 240 and so forth, and then you go to 60. You come back to a value you looked at before to see if you come out at about the same place, and then you go to 30, which is a shorter random interval, and then to 15-second, the shorter. So this is, you can convert these to reinforcements per hour, take the average of, let's say, the last 3 sessions, and you get functions, and these are functions from 3 different simulations for different birds, different computer birds, but they are reminiscent of the data that George Reynolds and I got back in that pigeon lab years ago. And those data for pigeons took us many, many, many months to get, and but you can get the molar functions out of this as well as the molecular. Now, this is still not finished, because what about the FI and the FR? I mean, those don't work here, because all this does is generate fairly homogeneous rates of responding over time. Well, there's another thing that Shimop and I had done in our earlier simulations and working with students, and that is we had come up with a simulation called the shaping game, in which the shaping game gave the student a little mouse bouncing up at the bottom of the screen, or at least this is one version of a shaping game. And the student also saw a distribution of response probabilities. And, well, gee, let's give you the historical example. Why talk about it when I can show you, okay? The mouse would appear somewhere along the screen. This is a distribution of probabilities. Essentially, this is a spatial continuum. The probabilities are 0 out here on the right, and the distribution starts out mostly bunched up against the left side. So where the bar is really high, there's a maximal probability that's where the mouse is going to turn up. Where the bars are relatively low, it will turn up with a lower probability. The computer generates a random number and starts summing these up until it matches the random number, and then makes the mouse bounce up there. If you reinforce when the mouse pops up there, what the thing does is adds to these probabilities in the region where the mouse popped up. If you don't reinforce, their probabilities decrease. Okay? But there's a little spreading effect, so that if you reinforce one out here, then you might get a spread to some of the neighboring regions. And by taking advantage of that, you can do shaping. So, for example, here's the mouse bouncing up in the middle. Here the mouse bounces up near the end here, and that's going to push it out. Now the distribution is moved way around. By the way, even though it may look at there are no graphics in this, this is all done with ASCII characters. I bet Shimop hadn't gotten around to this, so I had to do something. The ASCII characters were all I could handle. So here the distributions are kind of low. If all the distributions go to 0 because you don't reinforce everything, hey, that's very natural kind of extinction. But the other, and here the mouse is moved along there, and gradually the mouse ends up over here, and if the mouse then comes up at the extreme rightmost position, the students won the game, the mouse pops up along the bottom. Anyway, somewhere along the line, it hit me that every one of these bars is a little reserve. That what happens is, if this response occurs and you reinforce it, it kicks into the probability there. And if you extinguish it, if you don't reinforce it, it takes a little bit away. And these are reserves spread along the continuum, except they're close to each other. And so sometimes something spills over from one reserve to the neighboring one. So why not think about schedules that way too? How about, instead of there being distributed across temporal, across spatial dimension, you distribute them along time. And so maybe if you do that, and you've got temporal reserves working like the other ones, gee, maybe you could get fixed interval scallops. And maybe if you end up, and by the way, I've only done a little bit of this, so I can only show you some samples. You do kind of get the sort of transitions that Peter Dews used to talk about, how you get after a high rate FI you get a low rate one, and then you get a high rate one and low rate one. You tend to get those kinds of things even with random sort of thing. Now, these don't stay very stable, but that may be also because of the grain that I mentioned, and it does need a lot of tinkering with. The other thing I'm not too sure about is whether you need to have both reserves distributed along temporal dimension and reserves distributed along the number of responses dimension and the combination of those. But you can actually occasionally get things where you get a transition of pauses and a transition in FR. So although I cannot claim to you that I've got a single set of algorithms in which I've got a set of parameters in which they're all going to generate these kinds of things. I do know, by the way, that the FI one will also generate random interval. But I think as a feasibility thing, it seems to me it would be surprising, given that we can get this far with it, that we can't move along that far with some additional playing around with these kinds of parameters. And in that thing where we're looking at the distributions, at what point, if you had two different distributions at different places on a continuum, do they become two different response classes? You know, I showed you the shaping game and the distribution moving across from one side to the other. How about concurrent operands? How about discriminated operands? What does it mean for our units? How about if you had responses on two keys? How about if you run concurrent schedules and you run, say, a random interval 90 seconds on one key and a random interval 30 on one key and 90 on the other? Would you get kind of proportionality where the bird makes more responses on the shorter RI, where RI 30 seconds is the one on top that's delivering about 2 reinforcers per minute. The one on the bottom is RI 90, which is about a minute and a half per reinforcer. And hey, in this particular session it matches. It doesn't stay that way for a long time, but there's no changeover delay in this. There's, in fact, the real problem, I think, in running concurrence is to figure out how you manage the changeovers from one key to another. If you reverse the schedules, you do get a reversal so that these are sensitive at least to where the higher density is. And you know, the other thing that happens in concurrent schedules is if you run through ratios, then when you run through ratios, you tend to have responding drifts to the key with the shorter ratio. And so this is the computer simulation generating responding almost exclusively on the random ratio 30 schedule when a random ratio 60 schedule, the bigger one is on the other key. Now again, I cannot claim that this is ready to generate all of the matching law and so forth, except I think there's promise there. I think this suggests that we should not assume that those are different kinds of relations and they work over variables in extended periods of time and don't have any connection to the local contingencies. There is history stuff in here too, by the way. You can get a schedule in which if you work up gradually to a ratio, you can get it up there, but if you try to immediately go to the large ratio, the responding never makes it, and you get extinction. So you can build in a few things with history effects, although they're subtle. So anyway, this is mainly sort of case history. How much will this generalize to people doing other kinds of things? Hey, you got to find a problem, and I guess I was just lucky that I had a problem that was amenable to it. And one of the things was I was fortunate enough to have some coworker who was really helpful, and I guess I was kind of stubborn and I never let it go. And one of the other messages is, if you got a problem, you like to stick with it. Who knows? Maybe after 50 years you'll get the answer. But should we be aware of the flight to models? Well, I don't know. It does worry me that this is not real behavior. It's simulated behavior. But to the extent that it looks a lot like real behavior, maybe it's worth something. So a model generates good approximations to real behavior, can help us to see how behavior works. Be explicit about the terms and units and dimensions. I did have to worry about that in terms of these particular kinds of units. I did try to keep it simple. Hey, no, the input and the output is really pretty simple stuff. I did worry about the nature of the reserve, this reserve and things that went on, and I'm still worrying about things like how you work changeovers. I avoided anything that involved remote contingencies. This was easy to tinker with. Well, I set it up so that I could just enter a schedule value, enter changes in parameters and things, enter the size of the reserve and things of that sort, played around with the grain, did look for the connections. But don't overdo it. One of the cases there was, remember I mentioned that I was looking for something logarithmic in the input because the output was logarithmic in the extinction curves. That was a big mistake. So yeah, look for the connections, but don't overdo it. It really helped to know the programming languages. Stuck with it. That's it, folks. Thank you very much. Stunned silence.
Oh, that's the hard problem. Yeah, that's exactly. How do you do it with, even with concurrence? I've taken with various ways of doing it. Like, one is you have the two reserves for response, left response and direct response, and you generate a random number, and it comes up wherever it's going to come up within that single thing. But that didn't seem right, because then you don't have anything like the tendency to stick on one key, which you do have. So then you said, how about, well, first you sample the reserve for the response you're currently engaging in, then you sample the reserve for the other. And I think you have to worry about something like that in heterogeneous chains. I'm not quite sure how to do it. I suspect that for discrimination learning, for multiple schedules, for example, you could have something like a stimulus continuum. After all, that's what generalization gradients are, aren't they? And in fact, generalization gradients help in the way of thinking about that shaping game simulation. So if you were thinking about that as a stimulus dimension instead of a response dimension, the main thing there is you would control which stimulus is available and then see what the probability is. And maybe something about the way those dimensions change and work. I think these are, fundamental questions about our response units. And I don't think I'm close to understanding how that might work, but I have the feeling that these will help to find some answers about where units come from. Who knows? That's for you folks.
Do you have data on IRT better opportunity distribution?
No, the other thing that this had a limitation on was the amount of memory we had to work with. I mean, these were very small compared to what we can do today. My future directions, by the way, are, it turns out that Peter Colleen pointed out to me that we can now do these things on Excel. So I've been corresponding with him, and I think that you can get this so that you have the Excel columns being the various measures, and it'll just generate from the record that's the Excel graph. And once I get that, then you can drop all of that stuff out. But given that it's all the probabilistic things, I'm pretty sure that they've got to have the usual characteristics, because that's what went into it. And that's how they got generated. So the only question would be whether it was working properly. I do know that in some things that I did, the random generator that was used by this program had a couple of not quite random things in it that made a difference. In most cases, made no difference on the response end, but did in the scheduling end, where the interval schedules were having bunches of reinforcers. So this is really pretty crude stuff, and it strikes me though that it still does so much that makes it even more persuasive to me. If something that simple can do it, then where is it going to go once we can refine it? Let's see.
Presumably, if you want to include the amount of enforcement and size of enforcement, you simply change the size of the cell.
I accept the question was, what about the amount of reinforcement? Yeah, you could add that, except that in some situations, I know the magnitude of reinforcement doesn't make a heck of a lot of difference. Actually, what I also like to do is include association, because to have some kind of tie-in to things like relativity of reinforcement, the things that connect. Peter Colleen and I have been talking a little bit about what he calls coupling. things that involve the relationship between the response that's reinforced and the reinforcer. And I think in playing around with how you would work satiation into this, you have to think about those kinds of problems. So there are a whole bunch of parameters that this hasn't touched yet. And one can start thinking about it. In satiation, presumably you're not affecting the size of the reserve, but you're affecting the likelihood that those responses will be